It's wonderful to be here. And it is possible to get from Sudbury to here, in fact. As Rose said, we're quite close to Sudbury. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with a group of women who are making a difference in the lives of women in this city. And talking to Ida, I realize you're making a difference around the world. Of course, it's always a delight to visit with Rose, who, along with her mother Stephanie, has made a great deal of difference in my life and in my children's life, my husband's life. Being here with you reminds me that it was my generation of women which was the first to really go in significant numbers to university. And I remember how startled my parents were when I told them this was my intention. They were not opposed, they were just mystified. We lived in a small town in northern Ontario, and as my mother said, why would a girl need to go to college? She's just getting married anyway. And it was my good fortune that there was no man anywhere on the horizon. So they eventually came around to my plan. Going to the University of Toronto for me, meant considerable sacrifice for them. But together we made it happen. And no one could have been prouder than my parents in 1964 of the first university graduate in the family. What remains to me from those years is a profound and critical desire to understand how the world works and a pressing sense of responsibility for it. I had been given an education. This woman had been given an education. How could I prove I was worthy of it? Almost 50 years after the family photos on the lawn of Convocation Hall and the roses in the cap and gown, that question is the force behind my book. What is the responsibility of the elder today? It's my privilege to try to spell that out in readings about our mothers and our families and our country and ourselves. And I know that you're not all elders here yet, but eventually most of us get there. So I hope that this will interest you for that reason. I should explain that this book, The Long View, is a collection of 365 daily readings about elders. It's not about seniors or geezers or the aged or Zoomers or anything like that. It's about elders. People who have had some years of experience upon which they have reflected and gained wisdom. And sometimes it's hard for us as women to claim that wisdom. In fact, I find the subtitle of my book myself rather daunting, An Elder Woman's Book of Wisdom. There's a harsh little voice that some of you might know, it goes on inside of me that says, who are you? But I am a heart and divine experience I had several months ago when my then 5-year-old grandson grabbed my face, you know how to do with both of his hands, and looked at me lovingly and looked at my eyes and said, Nana, how long is it from kid to wrinkly? It's a long time. So I've had room to think, and so I'll begin. Not in any particular order. I'm just going to tell you about all these responsibilities. So, one responsibility we have, I think, is to learn from our mothers. For me at least, very difficult act of working out the supremely complicated relationship between mothers and daughters has taught me a great deal. And actually just watching how they function as women is important. So I'll read one of the passages from this book. Oh, there's a passage for every day of the year, as you've probably figured out, 365 passages. So this is January 7th. This is the day my mother died. She was 96, a strong, talented woman who cherished her children and adored her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She was also often irritable in her later years, sparking similar irritation in me that I did my best to conceal. Now, I have work to do. I need to figure out why we were the way we were. I need to make peace with her. In my late 60s, I should be well beyond blaming her for any part of the way I am, but I do. As a toddler, my mother had traveled with my grandmother from Vancouver to Northern Ontario. At age 9, she saw the Great Fire of 1922 devouring houses one by one down their street, stopped by a wind shift before it reached them. After she married, she and my father lived in a small log cabin with a wood stove. My mother deeply missed electricity and indoor plumbing. She once threw a naphtha gas-powered iron through the window, convinced of an imminent explosion. They soon moved to a more comfortable setting where they lovingly raised my brother and me. When my father died, my mother moved close to me. She was welcomed at our friends' homes as a treasured elder for the next 23 years. She grew more difficult with me. Perhaps I was one with whom she was able to be cranky, one she trusted would not desert her. Perhaps it was advancing blindness, discomfort, or her own inner issues. I struggled to remember when this wasn't so. Now my work is to understand. This is my chance to learn her strength and love, and as much as I can, avoid passing on her pain. I'm going on to January the 8th. I won't read, the reading for every day of the year. This one's about children. I remember this. My children were the saving grace between my mother and me. They visited her, teased her, loved her, were serenely, for the most part, aware of the pain I felt over the crankiness she and I seemed to create in one another. I would like to avoid my mother's desire to perfect her children, especially me, her daughter, long after the point where it might have been understandable. Surely we can give up perfecting our children once they are teens and able to think in an adult way. Surely we should never try to perfect our children. Perfection is a vastly overrated state of being. So we discover how not to blame others, especially our mothers, for the way we are. How not to be a perfectionist. And later, out of a very happy event in her very old age, I learned from my mother how deep in women is the desire to be productive. It is both our burden and our great joy. This one's from May 11th, and it's called My Mother Knitting. When my mother moved, resisting, into an assisted living residence, she was already 91 and blind. A staff member asked me what she had enjoyed doing before she lost her sight. I described her knitting, the treasured sweaters my children had worn and saved and passed on to the next generation. So I brought in needles and wool. The day after I did that, I found my mother knitting a scarf. Her first effort was an alarming length of pale blue wool full of holes. It was 6 inches wide in some places and 10 or 12 in others. It was for me. I have it still. When I was annoyed with her, I would refuse to wear it. She couldn't tell, and it made me feel childishly better. She did scarves for her son-in-law and scarves for her grandchildren. And soon, miraculously, her knitting became accomplished. There were fewer holes and the edges were even. Before she could get bored, her fashionista granddaughter suggested more color and sufficient length to wrap around the neck several times and still hang down. I was sent more frequently in search of wool, and soon my friends and the friends of friends, a whole Facebook of warmly wrapped individuals, sported very long, multicolored scarves. We resembled aged university students who either celebrated diversity in a big way or had no memory of what our college colors actually were. My mother was happy. She was productive again, even if she couldn't see her finished work. She knit and knit until at 94 her hands gave out and she couldn't hold the needles anymore. It took another year But that's when my mother, the elder who knit to keep her loved ones warm, began to die from lack of usefulness. So I think that I had begun to reach reconciliation with my mother when I began consciously, with my eyes open, thinking about it. I began consciously to cherish what she had cherished. And this is the last little section about my mother. It's called My Mother's China. My brother and I bought it for my mother one piece at a time when we were little. Someone, probably my dad, must have given us the money. Birthdays and Mother's Days and Christmas all meant a thin, translucent plate or cup and saucer, each picturing a tree in a stylized English garden setting. The set mount belongs to my daughter, but she's not ready for it. Meantime, it sits in my dining room, a mute recollection of long ago extended family dinners. The small plates held apple pie and ice cream, or after I learned to bake, chocolate cake, at which I excelled. The large plates were laden with crisply cooked vegetables grown in my father's garden, and elegant thin slices of roast carved with my father's sharp knife. My grandmother and assorted aunts and uncles would be there, in a haze of cigarette smoke that slowly cleared as year by year they gave up smoking. When we discovered that my brother was going blind, the plate at his place was illuminated with the brightest lamp in the house so he could see. And later the light was turned to illuminate my mother's plate as well. Life went on. Laughter returned. The vegetables continued to make their way from the garden to the plate, crisp and bright. The roasts became more tender as money grew less tight. My father died. My mother died. The dishes remain. When my children come home to visit, I will use these dishes. So I don't want you to think that this whole book is about my mother, but our relationship is one of about a dozen recurring themes in it, and it's the one about which my readers comment more than any other. I'm going to read one more to illustrate that our biological mother is not our only mother, nor is that the only reconciliation that is required of us. This is called A Planet in Pain. This is what I believe. We live in a holy earth created with just the right amounts of oxygen and carbon, water and heat to grow the food we need. Just as a baby thrives in its mother's womb, so we live in the womb of Mother Earth, utterly dependent on her for all our needs. And she is in trouble. I recently picked up Bill McKibben's book, Earth, Making Life on a Tough New Planet. The Earth as we knew it is gone, he says. The hydrological cycle in North America, for one example, has already changed so that in some areas we get terrible drought, and in others, devastating floods. The womb we have lived in for all of human civilization has become less than friendly. We may, McKibben says, this is a quote, with commitment and luck, yet be able to maintain a planet that will sustain some kind of civilization, but it won't be the same planet, and hence it can't be the same civilization. We need, therefore, to tell stories. This is the way it was, we must say to our beloved young who cannot remember the sea abundant and the forests endless, dark, and rich. Our memory of Earth's nourishing womb must be retained so that we can live in her again.